Chapter 5 Year 874 PXF Late Summer. The rest of the night had consisted of Wilfred telling several long and very dull stories about fishing as Osmond ate his evening meal and then settled in to sleep. The even cadence and distant quality of Wilfred's voice transported Osmond back to the Sojourn's Rest. The muffled din of the common room had become like a lullaby to him when returning to his own or Talon's rooms to find sleep after a long day at the keep or longer nights in taverns. And now, in the wilderness of Kaiflanor, Wilfred's voice did the same. For the first time since the siege of Arnador, nightmares did not plague Osmond's sleep, and he found the peaceful respite that had so long been denied him, calming his churning thoughts. Osmond awoke not at the first light of dawn after a scant few hours, but to the bright daylight of the risen sun long above the horizon. Osmond immediately felt the restorative effects of his night of uninterrupted peace. A clarity of thought and a feeling of being present in his own body filled him as he stood with a smile to greet the day. From the small knoll he had camped on, the vast plains of Kaiflanor spread for leagues in all directions. The sprawling tundra felt full of possibility and promise in the golden morning light, instead of seeming like an insurmountable obstacle. He could even imagine that something better lay beyond this trial. For a moment, Osmond's life felt as complete as it had been 2 years earlier as spring painted the fields of Elerjan. A daydream overtook his vision as he imagined that his Krodran would soon arrive after a morning hunt with some small game to roast on the fire. Osmond would greet Talon by reading his face with his hands, and Talon would read his own. They would sit and laugh and share their morning meal as brothers. Osmond would have a family again. A gust of wind rustling the fir trees around Osmond blew the fantasy away and brought him back to reality. He and Talon had never camped or even journeyed together outside Arnador. He had never taught his Krodran about the reading of faces, but now wanted nothing more than to share his with his big brother. Even with the turmoil in his head about how he should feel about Talon, Riken, and his father, his heart longed for connection in this moment. Letting only a single, lonely, shaky sigh escape his lips as loneliness's familiar keel sent a tingle through his back teeth, Osmond took one last look out across the landscape. With the cool winds of Kaiflanor tussling the curls in his hair and blowing them across his eyes, he turned back to his small camp to prepare for the day's travel. Wilfred sat stoically, glowering by the fire pit, the wood and embers long since turned to ash with just a thread of smoke still hinting at any remaining warmth. Fishing rod and pipe were nowhere to be seen as he sat with crossed arms and feet firmly planted on the ground. The Willico's stern expression softened as their eyes met, reading the complex emotions playing across Osmond's face. The fisherman abandoned whatever barbed remark he had planned, and instead said enthusiastically,
"Ah, there he is. Nothing like a good snoozle to clear the nets."
Wilfred continued in a grandfatherly fashion.
"Now stow all that extra tackle for another time, and get your hooks baited for the day at hand."
Wilfred's advice and demeanor swept Osmond's flash of loneliness and longing away, allowing him to tap back into the revitalized energy he had felt upon awakening. Not bothering to relight the fire, Osmond broke his fast with some traveloaf filled with dried fruits and grains he had bought in Volgendeep. He washed it down with a long draw from his waterskin and tossed a few berries foraged along his trek the day before into his mouth as he stowed his tarp and readied his pack. From every story Osmond knew of Willico, their existence was tied to a specific place, always encountered in the same way at some particular interval. They were resigned to repeating forever the same short excerpt of their lives and emotions that had become imprinted on the elemental forces at work in a specific location. Osmond had just been lucky enough to stumble upon this one when he needed reminding of why he was on this journey. Once prepared to leave, Osmond turned to Wilfred seated by the fire, dropping to one knee with bowed head in reverence.
"Thank you, Wilfred, for sharing my fire and bringing me company."
May you find the same peace you brought me. Wilfrid reached out an incorporeal hand and laid it on Osmond's shoulder. Osmond felt no weight or sensation from the gesture, but it comforted him. The Willico gave a slight nod and gruffly stated,
Now if that isn't the chef's portion of your meal, I don't know what is. But enough of that.
Wilfrid reclaimed his hand and tapped his index finger on his nose.
I can smell when someone is casting for a rare catch, and I'm not gonna have you fishing in my waters without at least giving me a shot of landing that lunker myself.
An oversized ghostly pack appeared out of thin air, with Wilfrid's stowed rod and an assortment of pots, pans, and lures decorating the outside of it. The Willico slung it over his shoulders and marched out of camp. Osmond remained on one knee momentarily, assuming that this was just the end of the Willico's looping existence, the opposite bookend to his arrival and demanding a fire be lit. The hollow keel of being alone once again manifested as a tingling in his molars, not unlike hitting an elbow at the wrong angle. As Osmond had done hundreds of times before when loneliness struck him, he set his jaw, took a deep breath, and steeled himself to carry on.
Stonefather, give me strength! I swear you are slower than a snail swimming upstream in a river of molasses!
Wilfrid barked from the tree line. Osmond remained momentarily stunned, still down on one knee and unsure if Wilfrid was now acting independently or within the normal confines of its existence. None of the tales Osmond knew spoke of Willico traveling far from where someone had encountered it. Not wanting to risk another admonishment, he scrambled to his feet to follow the enigmatic spirit. Wilfrid did not bother to wait for him to catch up or lead the way. Osmond just heard Wilfrid's voice calling back from up the trail.
There's a stream up ahead. I suggest you take advantage of it. You smell worse than a basket of dead crabs left in the sun.
Year 874 PXF. Early autumn. Nearly 3 weeks had passed since Wilfrid had come into Osmond's life. The Willico had never faded or reached some endpoint on its existence that reset it back to the campfire where they met, even though Osmond had begun to wish it would. While Wilfrid was an excellent guide, knowing all the best places to camp, find water and shelter when needed, he was not the easiest of travel companions. Long, tedious, and repetitive stories of catching or chasing some fish, peppered with questionable generalizations and statements about other tribes of the Isles and peoples of Valknor, streamed endlessly from the Willico, day and night. In addition, Wilfrid seemed to have a bottomless well of barbed remarks for Osmond. The browbeatings came not only when chance or folly would delay their journey, but also for any regular tasks Osmond performed around camp or along their path. The kindness and sincerity Wilfrid exhibited at the camp the day of their first meeting had been non-existent over their time traveling together since then. Any hint of sentience beyond the repetition of phrases and stories had disappeared entirely. The immediate and unnecessarily hurtful rebukes of his every action and his unkind words about others in his stories made Osmond wonder what kind of person Wilfrid might have been in life. Osmond's frustration with the Willico's insults had finally come to a head 2 nights earlier. After a day hiking to the same tiresome stories and then a string of complaints about Osmond's every action at camp, berating Osmond for being the dullest knife in the block, the slowest minnow in the school, and as graceful as a squid soaked in sangria, Osmond snapped. The skin of his scalp behind his ears felt like someone had lit his hair on fire with a torch as anger's keel overtook him.
Then why don't you go bake your bobbers on someone else's campfire and leave me the hells alone?
Osmond roared. Any concern with being respectful of Willico had long since faded.
All you do is complain and nitpick every last thing I do. Were you this hateful when you were alive? 'Cause you sure are a pain in the arse and unbearable to be around now that you're dead.
If Wilfrid had been corporeal, Osmond would have punched him. But all he had were his words, so he maliciously added,
No wonder you're a Willico. Even the Sullenfell got sick of you.
A torrent of dwarven curses flowed out of Wilfrid that Osmond could neither translate nor care to understand. As he prepared for his next verbal attack, constructing the cruelest sentiment he could conceive, Osmond got in Wilfrid's face, practically nose to nose with the Willico. That's when Osmond saw the utter shame and remorsefulness in Wilfrid's eyes. The juxtaposition to the Willico's words surprised him, but he would not let it stop him from having his say. Then, in a flash, Osmond realized what was happening. Everything after that first night was the cycle that trapped Wilfrid, the echo of his life he was doomed to repeat. The flames of rage burning at Osmond's temples extinguished as quickly as if he had plunged his head into one of the pools Wilfrid had constantly insisted he bathe in. The stream of epitaphs and curses continued to flow out of Wilfrid, but his eyes seemed to notice the change in Osmond. Hope filled them as a ghostly tear pooled in the corner of one eye. Osmond sat back on his heels and asked gently, "What can I do?" The words somehow cut through the barrage of insults, and Wilfrid shook his head, not having an answer. Even if he did, Osmond knew he could not communicate it through the ongoing tirade. Osmond closed his eyes and opened his senses, letting his body act instinctively. His arms raised of their own accord, and his eyes reached out to Wilfrid's face. Eyes still closed, what Osmond's fingers encountered was not incorporeal air. They found the exhausted face of an old fisherman who had lost more than he could bear in life, and was terrified that he was on the verge of losing all over again. Wilfrid's curses ended abruptly. Silence engulfed camp, leaving the two lone figures silhouetted under the shifting luminescence of the Solenfell and the endless sky of Kaiflanor. Osmond slowly opened his eyes. He saw his fingers gently laid on the surface of Wilfrid's incorporeal face, creating tiny ripples at the contact, but his senses read the emotions etched there as though they were living skin. Osmond reverently stated what he saw there. "You had a son that you drove away." Wilfrid gave a slight nod of affirmation. His gaze pulled Osmond in as the story unfolded under Osmond's touch. "Your son longed for adventure, but not at sea. He wanted to explore the land." Osmond saw in his mind's eye a lean, gangly young man so different from Wilfrid, but with features that left no doubt that he was of the same blood. Osmond watched the young man as he coiled a rope awkwardly, not just due to an inherent lack of coordination, but also his distracted glances across the docks, past the small fishing port, and to the mountains beyond. Osmond began to speak again, and then was interrupted by a wince that passed through himself and the Willico. Through Osmond's fingers, the story in his mind had continued to unfold. The living fisherman Wilfrid had once been had entered the scene and struck the young man. It was not a playful jab, but a brutal clap to the ear done with anger and hostility. Within the vision, Osmond heard the echo of the familiar insult that followed.
"You have all the skill of a squid soaked in sangria."
The fisherman then ripped the rope from his son's hands, throwing it to the ground.
"Do it again, you witless sea slug. Mollusks are mages compared to you."
Osmond almost pulled away from the Willico. So vile was the tone and intent of the living man in the vision. He had suspected that Wilfrid might not have been a good man in life, but the man he had just witnessed wasn't just bad. He was cruel and malicious. Osmond would have broken contact with the Willico and walked away, no longer interested in being of help to it in any way, if it hadn't been for the absolute shock and horror written on Wilfrid's face that he felt through his fingers. It was as if the Willico was also seeing this memory fully for the first time. The Willico certainly knew the insult and had thrown the exact phrase at Osmond many times, but he did not seem to have known the context. Wilfrid's pleading eyes convinced Osmond to reluctantly leave his fingers in place on the Willico's face, so together they might learn more. Wilfrid's son slowly and carefully recoiled the rope as the side of his face swelled into an angry red bruise. A familiar, crossed-arm, glowering stare followed every movement of the young man as he timidly completed the task. There was not a hint of remorse in the fisherman, just indignation and disapproving judgment of his offspring. Wilfrid was mortified by the actions of the man who shared his face. Osmond pondered to himself, isn't a Willico just a remnant of the person they were? How could the fisherman in his vision and the echo of him have such different reactions to the same event? Osmond wondered how long Wilfrid had wandered Kaiflanor as a Willico. Turning his mind back to the vision, Osmond searched for clues as to when this event he was reading on Wilfrid's face might have occurred. He focused on the port, which he did not recognize, and looked to the mountains Wilfrid's son had so longed for. Osmond pushed his mind deeper into the memory. He spoke out loud as he had done previously. Not mountains, but a plateau. Osmond pulled more details from Wilfrid. The Emerald Highlands. By the gods, that's Jadenpool! Osmond now recognized the single low building that still existed in the Zalian capital, the old counting house. He and Serena had visited the oldest structure in Jadenpool on one of their weekends together before the events that relocated their rendezvous to the south. You lived centuries before the Zalian Empire was even founded. Wilfrid pondered for a moment, then nodded. Osmond continued. That is over 2,500 years ago. You've been wandering here for all that time? Wilfrid nodded again. That's 6 lifetimes. Osmond then added introspectively, You aren't him anymore, are you? If you ever really were, other than at your creation. Wilfrid sighed and smiled as ghostly tears welled up further in his eyes. Through his fingers, Osmond could feel and read Wilfrid's deep relief in finally being understood and seen. It echoed the same emotion Osmond had felt with Alaris. The overwhelming feeling of acceptance and understanding that comes from someone recognizing the totality of your story, even if they don't approve of all the twists and turns it might have taken along the way. Wilfrid finally spoke. He seemed to struggle painfully to find the words and break free of the repeated phrases from his living self. Thank you, Osmond. I'm sorry. It was the first time Wilfrid had used his name. In answer, Osmond, as though a Willico himself, repeated the gesture the Bloom Sage had gifted him. He placed their foreheads together reverently. After a moment, Osmond sat back on his heels, placed his hands in his lap, and said directly and earnestly, I forgive you, Wilfrid. Wilfrid leaned forward and said slowly, You stink. Osmond couldn't help but chuckle. I know, Wilfrid. I will wash again in the next stream. No, Wilfrid said frustratingly. The last person who smelled as bad had a dead fish in their net. So you've told me 12 times. Getting to his feet, Osmond replied with a gentle dismissiveness reflective of all they had been through in the last hour, as opposed to the defensiveness he typically snapped back with. Wilfrid blocked his path. A dead fish full of worms. Wilfrid was getting more frustrated and snapped at Osmond in a tone akin to the fisherman he had been when he was alive. Listen, you chowderhead! Catching himself with an exasperated sigh and struggle akin to his apology. You stink like the last person. He had a dead fish full of worms. Wilfrid's eyes pleaded with Osmond to understand. Osmond now gave more thought to Wilfrid's words, repeating them back. I smell the same as the last person. A person who had a dead fish full of worms. Understanding hit Osmond like an avalanche cascading down his spine, sending chills from his scalp to his toes. Dear gods! My father, carrying the corrupted soul of Riken. You saw my father! Osmond looked to Wilfrid, who was signaling with his hands to keep going. Osmond continued, having to sit on a log as his knees became far too wobbly to support him. Not just saw,
traveled with, yes?
With a pointed look at Osman, Wilfred nodded and added,
You stink.
His speech, still encumbered by phrases he had said in life, was limiting what he could say, but Osman was convinced that there was more Wilfred needed to convey. Taking this perceived cue, Osman dug deeper and asked,
I stink because I am my father's son? Because we are related?
Osman could see answering a direct question was a struggle for Wilfred, but the Willico finally replied,
Aye, but more. The dead fish. The worms.
Osman thought back to the Solonrone chieftain, who also said he had a stench about him. The smell of the new gods and the Northlands flooded his soul.
I smell like Riken and the corruption?
Osman asked, almost afraid of the answer.
Aye,
Wilfred stated, with a mournful excitement at Osman's understanding.
The same, but different.
Wilfred struggled and seemed unhappy with the words that he found, saying with a grimace of frustration,
A salmon returning to spawn in the river where it was born.
Osman didn't know how to interpret that, and no matter the question he asked, Wilfred seemed unable to articulate anything that would provide more clarity. Did it mean the corruption had infected Riken, had left, and was now returning? Or that he was returning to the Argestian inception following his father's path? Or that, just like his father, he was burdened with Riken's future? There were too many possibilities, and every course led to more confusion and further questions. The night was quickly growing cold. In the 3 weeks of travel with Wilfred and their path ever southward, the 2 hours of twilight gloaming that previously passed as night were now 4 of true darkness. The low angle of the sun's daytime warmth no longer held back autumn's early advance as it encroached on Kaiflanor. If Osman didn't find the elemental inception soon, he would have to find a place to shelter for the darkest months of winter. But that was all worries for tomorrow. Now he needed a fire for warmth and shelter from the wind. The rest of the night in camp was as peaceful as the first had been. Whatever compulsion that had driven Wilfred to his combative attitude no longer pressed him to berate Osman. Osman watched the Solenfell ripple overhead as he ate, while Wilfred smoked his pipe and fished in the fire. While the wonder of the Solenfell's majesty was still locked away from Osman, he no longer felt alone.